Hello, in this video I'm going to demonstrate use of methods in a class. Now I have a program ready which is creating a variable of product class, and if I go back to the product class, I have a simple product class with private member variables. Now since we know that the private member variables cannot be accessed outside of the class such as this one, we must provide a way to access them using methods. Now let us write a function called init. Now in the init, I can receive the parameters that I want to initialize. I'll declare int id, string name, and double price. Now since the method is void, it is not expecting any return type. However, within this particular block of the function init, now there are 6 variables that can be accessed. 3 which are parameters which are local to this block, meaning as soon as this function call is over, those 3 variables will be removed from the memory. However, within the same scope, we also can access the member variables ID, name, and price. So how can I assign a value which is received in the form of parameters to the member variable? Can I do ID equals to ID? Now there is no error as such, but then this is of no use because when you say ID here and here, compiler would treat that as this variable, which is the parameter, because local variables are given higher preference than the member variables. Now if you remember, we used to use underscore id as a parameter name to distinguish that. So if I do an underscore id here and then underscore id here, now compiler has no problem in distinguishing the member variable and the parameter. As you can see, id means this is the variable, whereas this id here refers to the member variable. However, using underscores is not a good convention. This problem can be solved by using a keyword called this. Now if you say this dot id, we are actually accessing a member variable using a reference. Now this reference is nothing but a reference which invoked this function from here. For example, if I said p1.init 12 and something like optical mouse price 5.9, now you see the reference p1 which is invoking this init. Of course, I have to initialize this before doing new product. Now you can see that P1 is the invoking object or reference which is invoking this init. So P1 is actually stored in this. Now that happens because when we supplied here 3 parameters, internally it supplies P1 also as the very first argument. And that argument implicitly is received in a variable here as the very first one, which is called this. So this refers to P1, and P1.id is nothing but the P1's member variable ID. Similarly, I can say this dot name equals to name, this dot price equals to price. So we receive the variables and we assign them to the member variables. Now you can do any validations before this, such as, for example, you can say if ID is less than or equals to 0, it is invalid. Probably you can say throw new runtime exception and probably giving a message invalid ID. Similarly, you can say that if there is a price is less than or equals to 0, I don't want to assign, I'll just say throw new runx or runtime exception of a message. The message would be invalid price. And similarly, I can check if name is equals to null or name dot trim dot length equals to 0, then I say throw new run exceptions or runtime exception of something like empty name not allowed. So you can just give some error and stop the execution of the program but if everything is okay, we would be assigning. Now, exception handling will be discussed in a different lecture. Now that we have assigned this value, we need to have a way of printing. Now, as you can see, we don't have a function to print the values. So, we can write a function to print a value here, or we can make use of Eclipse as a helping tool here. So, we can say p1.print. Now, obviously, print is not found and Eclipse is giving me an error. But Eclipse just doesn't give an error, it also gives you solutions. So, when I press Ctrl 1 on that error line, you can see it says create a method called print in the type or class product. And you see it's also showing it's green because we are accessing from outside of the product class. It is expected to be public. So you can see it is giving public void print and some code. So that is the code that's going to be inserted. So we don't have any function called print here, but as soon as I say add a method, and you can see it is added public void print, and then I can go and add my printing stuff such as system.out.println id equals to plus id, name equals to plus name, and price equals to plus a dollar and a price. And of course, I'll align them nicely and save it. So execute the program. I'm able to initialize and access those values. So we can pass parameters. The parameters are received over here. We can validate them before actually assigning them to the members. And then using the keyword this, we refer to that particular member variables. In case if I supply a value such as minus 59 or 5.9 or just a 0, now that's an invalid price. You can see that, let's put a line number. You can see that the line number 11 will break the execution of the program by giving an exception. And it says here that exception in thread main, java.lang.runtime exception, and it says invalid price. This is the message that we gave before throwing the object, and the error happened at line number 11. And that's because it caused a problem and it did not go forward to print it. So I supply something like 2.9, no problem, execute, and we are able to get the result. Let us look at another concept called overloading. Now imagine I don't have all the values here for initializing. Let's consider creating another product object. So I'll say here product p2 equals to new product, and then I would like to initialize with only ID and name because I don't know the price. So I'll say here p1.init, let's say 13, and then I'm just going to go give here something like mobile phone. Now that gives me an error because the init function that we have defined has 3 parameters, whereas I'm only supplying 2 of them. And it's giving a message and solutions. It says add argument to match the one init with int, string, and double, or change to some other method that Eclipse is figuring it out that it is okay. Change the init method signature and remove the parameter double. So that means it's trying to say, hey, let's remove it from here to suit this way of calling. But in that case, this would give a problem. However, there is also one more option that says that create a method called init with int and string as parameters in the data type product. And that's okay with me. Now, when I select that, I come back with this method. And here we have a public void init, which takes int I. Of course, we could have given that message. You can see that the variable names can be changed. So I can go to public void init int I instead of ID. I will make it as ID. String, I can make it as name. And then of course, I don't want this to do because I'm going to do something now. And I can now supply whatever these two are received to this particular function. But then I also have to supply a price. Now I can give a default price of $1. For example, I can say here that init and I'll type ID name. Now if I stop here, this is called as a recursion because whoever calls this function will supply some ID and name, and that will call the same thing again by supplying the same thing. Now of course, that goes into an infinite loop and never stops, and then you will get an stack overflow error. So we would like to ensure that we are not calling this method, but we are calling the other method by supplying 1.0. Now you can see I am calling init with 3 arguments, and that is going to be passed on to this particular function, which goes through the validations and so on. So which means if I supply a wrong value for this, and even like for example an empty string I supply, and that will break because p1.init calls this init, and that init is going to pass on to the init with 3 arguments, and name equals to null or an empty string here is going to throw an exception, and that exception is passed on back over here. We didn't handle the exceptions, and that exception will be propagated to this line. So eventually line number 13 will break. So let's go give it a try, and you can see that I got an error, and the error is at line number 13. Now we will bring it back to mobile phone and execute, and of course we wanted this to be for P2, and then we also will print P2.print, and of course we would like to add a new line character so that we see a line break. And so when I execute this code now, program 1, I'll see 2 products, and you can see that the second product is given $1 as the price. Now of course that's because we don't know what is the price at this point in time, so we're just taking it as $1. Of course if you don't want, you could actually supply 0, and that is also okay.